Today in Civil Liberties History. What happened on this day in Civil Liberties History? Today, the day you are watching this video. Now you can find out. Hi, I'm Sam Walker, and I've created a website, Today in Civil Liberties History, which has important events in civil liberties history for each day of the year. That includes the terrible assaults on our rights and also the many struggles and great victories that have helped expand our liberties. April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson gave a speech where he famously called for a war to make the world safe for democracy. What few people noticed was that in the same speech, he warned that if there was disloyalty, it would be met with a stern hand of repression. Repression there was. The government suppressed virtually all dissent against the war during World War I. On July 7, 1917, just 3 months later, the post office banned the August 1917 issue of The Masses magazine, probably the most prominent anti-war magazine of the period. In the 1920s, the most famous civil liberties case was the Scopes monkey trial. That's where biology teacher John T. Scopes was prosecuted for teaching evolution in his high school biology class in violation of a Tennessee law that outlawed the teaching of evolution. The battle over religion in the schools and evolution continues to this day. Probably the worst violation of civil liberties in American history began on February 19, 1942. President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order authorizing the military to remove people from the West Coast. The military then removed 120,000 Japanese Americans, and they were then placed in relocation centers, which were better called concentration camps. Probably the worst violation of civil liberties ever in American history. The Cold War involved sweeping assault on freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and freedom of association. The anti-communist hysteria reached a new peak on February 9th, 1950, when Senator Joe McCarthy burst onto the public scene, gave a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he claimed to have a list of communists in the federal government. McCarthyism, as it came to be called, was marked by just irrational and unfounded charges of subversion and communist sympathies. In the face of attacks on American liberties, people fought back, often with acts of individual courage. For example, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus, and her act inspired further challenges to segregation all across the country. Perhaps the most courageous challenge involved the Little Rock Nine. These were 9 African-American students who were lawfully admitted to Central High School in Little Rock. And on September 4th, 1957, when they tried to enroll at the school, they were greeted by a howling mob of racists who were threatening violence. And it took the intervention of federal troops to actually get them enrolled several weeks later at Central High School. Some of the greatest assaults on American liberties were perpetrated by the FBI. But did you know that it was President Franklin D. Roosevelt who on August 24th, 1936, authorized the FBI to resume intelligence gathering on alleged subversive activities? Spying by the FBI had actually been ended in the 1920s by President Coolidge. Did you know that there was a time when you could get arrested for publishing a poem in the United States? Well, you could, and it happened. On June 3rd, 1957, Lawrence Ferlinghetti was arrested for publishing Allen Ginsberg's famous poem, Howl, now regarded as an American classic. Well, they fought back and they were acquitted of the obscenity charges in what was then a great victory for freedom of expression. The battle for women's rights has been long and involving many, many issues, including the right to suffrage, the right to vote, equality in employment, and reproductive rights. January 23rd, 1973, the Supreme Court established a constitutional right to abortion in the famous case of Roe v. Wade. Ironically, on that very same day, former President Lyndon Johnson died. It's ironic because Lyndon Johnson was the first president to authorize federal funds for birth control and family planning, which occurred on November 2nd, 1965. So why did I create this website? Well, it's a fascinating subject. I got very interested in it, but also it's important in terms of public education. The struggle over individual rights is not just in the courts. It's really in the court of public opinion. And it's important that Americans know about the history of this event and how fragile our rights can be and how easily they can be taken away.